This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is Sarah Lancaster, K-State Weed Specialist, and Pat Geier, K-State Weed Scientist, as they explain how water quality can impact herbicide effectiveness. K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan keep the show rolling as they discuss factors soybean growers should consider as they get ready for planting. Abbey Draut, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Sedgwick County, ends the show with ways to increase fruit and vegetable yield in a home garden. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about how water quality can impact herbicides with K-State Weed Specialist Sarah Lancaster and K-State Weed Scientist Pat Geier. Sarah, Pat, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Sarah, what are some factors that impact water quality?
So there's a handful of things that impact water quality, Shelby. Some of them you can see and some of them you can't, right? So here in Kansas, one of the things we often think about would be just the hardness of the water, right? So how many cations are hanging out in that water that could potentially interact with our herbicides and keep them from being effective. Another thing that we can't see is pH. So typically we don't talk a ton about spray water pH. There are some products that will break down faster in low pHs, so we have to be careful of that. And then the one that we can see is turbidity. And so we don't usually think about turbidity as a problem for our groundwater sources, but it is more of a concern for our surface water.
What are the concerns when it comes to turbidity?
As far as turbidity goes, as Sarah mentioned, we mostly see that in our surface waters. But the things that contribute to our turbidity would be things like algae growth in the water, clay, so if it just looks dirty, the water does, minerals, or if we have organic matter, say we have leaves at the bottom of the pond that are decaying and you get that brownish, brackish looking water. Those are the types of things that we look for in turbid water, I should say. There's really not much we can do about that other than either getting a different source for our water or letting that turbidity settle out as much as we can before we use that water. There are some products out there that are called chelating agents that we can add to the water that'll help draw those particulates out of the water as well.
Another thing Sarah mentioned, the pH level, and is this something that producers should take the time to test for?
Yes, they should. We highly recommend that anybody who's using either a surface or a subsurface water have that water tested. And pH is one of the factors that they'll look at. Sarah mentioned the cations, which are positively charged ions like, say, calcium, sodium, magnesium. A good water test will tell the producer what's in that water. And if we know what's in our water, then we can take steps to mitigate their effects on the herbicides. So,
are there ever any positives to the pH being more acidic or basic?
So most water in Kansas is going to be pretty close to neutral in terms of the pH, Shelby. But we do know some herbicides, like some of the group 2 herbicides, they can be more effective when we get our pH a little higher. Okay, so if you have a more acidic water source, you may want to raise your pH to increase the effectiveness of some of our group 2 herbicides and some of our bleaching herbicides. On the other hand, I was recently talking with an agronomist about spray water pH, and he actually did have a higher pH. And so we talked through some of the concerns about how Valor can break down faster when the pH gets too high. So in some cases, the high pH makes them work better. And in some cases, the high pH actually makes those products break down faster and not be as stable in your spray tank. And, you might think that stability is not too big of a deal, but if the pH gets too high, the half-life of that product goes from days to minutes. So it can be an issue, especially if you think you might have to mix and then you're going to get rained out or something like that.
What does water hardness when it comes to thinking about herbicide effectiveness?
The water hardness, when we're talking about herbicides, is many of our herbicides form a weak acid solution when we mix it with our water. So they'll have a slight negative charge. Well, if we have a lot of these cations in our water, which is very common in Kansas, we have a lot of calcium and sodium ions in particular, those cations can actually interact with our weak acidic herbicides, so they will tie up things like, for example, glyphosate is the one we talk about quite a bit. Those cations can actually interact with our glyphosate molecule and prevent them from attaching to the site of action within the plant. So it actually physically changes the structure of that glyphosate molecule so that it's no longer active in the plant. So typically with, say, glyphosate and glufosinate, those types of herbicides, we recommend that producers add ammonium sulfate prior to putting the herbicide into the tank. And what that ammonium sulfate, or AMS, does is it forms ammonia ions, and those ions actually tie up those cations in the water. And if we can do that before we put our herbicide in, then those cations are no longer available to tie up our herbicides.
At what point is the water hardness too hard?
Typically, the scale that most people use is it goes from 0 to 75 parts per million is considered soft water. And then from 75 to 150 parts per million is where we start getting into hard. And our waters in Kansas, typically, it's going to vary quite a bit across the state, but a lot of them run from that 150. They can even run up to 1,000 parts per million or more. So in general, we just have hard water here in Kansas. If you're using our water, you could almost bet it's going to be hard water.
What are some other things that producers could do to helpfully combat hard water?
So I think, Shelby, the first thing that folks need to do when they're thinking about dealing with hard water is to get a test. And one thing to think about is if you're used to getting your water tested for your household, actually the standards there are going to be a little more stringent than for ag spray, right? Like we're trying to take care of appliances and things like that for those household types of tests. So I would say go to your well or your water source for spraying, use the exact same source, pull a sample, and there are any number of labs that will run that test for a fee. Some of the numbers I've heard for fees are somewhere around $20 to around $40, depending on the lab. The next thing to do is to get that test result back and then look at the total hardness of the water. But if you can actually break that down even more into what types of cations are included. And there was a weed scientist by the name of Rich Zollinger who worked at NDSU for many, many years. And as far as I know, he's the one who worked out this equation to figure out how much AMS do I actually need to neutralize those cations in my water. So the easiest thing to do is to add AMS, and we talk about rates from like 8.5 pounds per 100 gallons of water up to 17 pounds per 100 gallons of water. But if you don't, like slinging bags of dry AMS, which I don't know anybody who does, and B, want to save a little bit of money, either by making sure you're not over conditioning your water or making sure that you have enough AMS to condition your water properly, you can get that equation and actually run the answers from your water sample through that equation, and it'll tell you how much AMS you need in terms of pounds of AMS per 100 gallons of water. So that's a pretty handy tool. And actually, if I remember correctly, Pat, in the e-update, we have a link to an online calculator, Excel sheet sort of thing that folks can grab and just punch the numbers in and get an answer real fast.
Yes, that's correct, sir. A couple other things that a producer might think about. I was visiting with a gentleman today, and he was telling me that on some of his herbicides, he has gone to using a lower spray volume. So basically, instead of spraying it, say, 10 or 15 gallons of water per acre, he's gone down to about 5 gallons of water per acre. So if we cut our water in half and we still add the same amount of herbicide, basically we're reducing the amount of cations that we're spraying, or the amount of cations that are available to interact with that herbicide. So that's one thing a person can do as well.
So that's an interesting idea, Pat. I think, maybe the flip side to that is just remind folks that we often talk about the importance of spray volume when we're using contact herbicides. So I think there's probably a line there, and folks will have to figure out what works the best for their water.
Yes, I would definitely recommend that they check their herbicide label to make sure that they're not getting too low on their spray volume or getting too high on their spray volume. So definitely a good point, sir.
Sarah, Pat, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks so much, Shelby. It was great to be here.
It's always a pleasure, Shelby.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster and K-State weed scientist Pat Geier. I will link an agronomy e-update article on this subject in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about soybean planting considerations with K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan. Logan, Tina, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us on, Shelby.
Yes, thanks.
Tina, as we're thinking about soybean planting, wanting to consider seeding rates, and what are a few important things to keep in mind?
Well, we're talking about seeding rates because the seed costs are up there. We don't want to be planting too many seeds in a low yielding environment. There's kind of some considerations when it comes to what's a good seeding rate when it comes to soybeans. Some of the studies that we kind of denoted in our e-update last week will kind of tell you that there's a pretty wide range in seeding rates, anywhere between 69,000 seeds per acre up over 270,000 seeds per acre. Well, what does this big range mean? Soybeans have the ability to, if there's less plants per acre, they can branch out. But also when you start branching out too much, they might not have as much, depending on other factors, you might not have as many pods per branch. It's a give and a take. Soybeans are indeterminate, so that they have the ability to, if there's more space, they can continue growing if growing conditions are correct. They've got the right day length. We've still got good growing degree units. They can keep growing in their vegetative stage. But once we hit a certain day length, they're going to switch over to reproductive, more branches, potentially more pods. When it comes to a low yielding environment, say, the conditions are not going to always be fantastic, say shallow soils, concerns of flash drought, such as southeast Kansas, in a lot of our previous years, they're kind of that low yielding environment some of the time. I don't want to say most of the time, that's being too pessimistic, but some of the time they can be a low yielding environment. We want to go with a higher count, higher seeding rate, such as 127, 130, up to 144,000 seeds per acre in those low yielding environments. Compared to a high yielding environments, we want less plants per acre. So that 96 and 97,000 per acre.
As we're thinking about soybean planting, also important to consider row spacing, and which should it be, Logan, 15 inches or 30 inches?
Yeah, so in addition to seeding rate, we also need to think about our row spacing. And in soybeans, the two primary row spacings that we're going to be working with are 30 inches and 15. 30 inches is more kind of our standard. Historically, it's kind of left over from the days when inter-row cultivation was much more common and we needed to be able to get in there between the rows to control weeds. There are several benefits and reasons why producers might want to think about 15-inch row spacing, and especially when it comes to all aspects of the crop. Some really interesting work was conducted here in Kansas comparing these two across different environments, and really in terms of a yield benefit, we see the biggest benefit in narrowing those row spacings up in those low yield environments like Tina described. As we move into more of a medium and high yielding environment, we have really good growing conditions. That crop is vigorously growing and filling in. And usually the response to 15 to 30, it's pretty flat. Reasons why, even if we don't see a yield benefit per se with narrowing row spacing up in soybeans, why we still might consider it is, for me, the big thing is weed suppression. Especially as we think about herbicide-resistant weeds, namely water hemp and palmer amaranth across the state. When we narrow those row spacings up with something like a soybean, we're able to close that canopy faster, suppress some of those later emerging palmer and water hemp plants, as well as all the other weeds that are out there, and really seeing a benefit from that from an integrated weed management perspective. Something that does get pointed out, I'm in western Kansas, of course, but something that gets pointed out as you move east is in wetter conditions, this does present some challenges when we have too many plants out there and too narrow row spacing can be problematic in areas where we know we've got real hot spots for things like soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome. So it's really important to have an idea of what your weather's going to look like and really what your field history is in terms of past experience dealing with soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome as you're making this decision of 30 versus 15. But we do see a lot of advantages out there to the 15-inch row spacing.
Logan, if someone like Chip Redmond, our meteorologist here at K-State, is predicting either a wetter or drier growing season, is that something that growers should take into consideration?
Yeah, there's always that trade-off, right? Where we're trying to balance, that maximizing the potential of that crop out there with also being on the conservative side, knowing that if we have more plants out there and they're spaced more closely together, we've got greater competition or potential for competition with water. So absolutely, and especially as we move further west in the state firmly into central Kansas, we want to be especially more considerate of what that outlook looks like. We can also utilize our knowledge of what our current soil moisture looks like as we're going into planting. If we know that we've got a profile like we're going into wheat stubble, or if we're in a little bit more of an iffy spot, maybe following grain sorghum. Some years we don't always have the profile. We do have that opportunity to flex some of this, widening that row spacing if it looks like we're going to be dry, dropping that seeding rate down if it looks like we're going to be dry. Just knowing that soybeans do have some flex in their growth with that indeterminate growth habit.
What planting dates should growers keep in mind when they're getting ready to get in their fields?
So when it comes to planting date, when we think of the state of Kansas, there's 4 zones. Northwest Kansas falls into a zone, then kind of the southwest that outreaches to the northeast is zone 2. Zone 3 is kind of south central to central eastern Kansas, and then deep southeast Kansas falls into zone 4. So for zone 1, kind of that northwest, say May 10th to June 1st. Zone 2, also May 10th to June 1st. So zone 1, zone 2, relatively the same time. Zone 3, we can start getting later into the season. So May 10th to June 10th. And then zone 4, again, that deep southeast area of May 10th to June 25th. But it's important to remember with these wide ranges, we don't want to have soybeans coming into pod development when it's potentially going to be super dry and super hot.
Do we need to keep in mind maturity groups when we're thinking about soybean planting?
Absolutely. That's another great point, Shelby. So when it comes to maturity group recommendations for Kansas, we're really going to be working in that range from our group twos down to our group fives. Group twos being primarily recommended for that far northwest area, those couple of irrigated soybean growers we got up in the northwest, all the way down to those group fives, very late maturing type soybean varieties in the far southeast. Picking the right maturity group for your environment is really important. So knowing where you fall in that range, that preference for a group 3 over a group 4 that really dominate the landscape. An important caveat to keep in mind for folks is that as we're shifting our planting dates, we really don't need to be shifting around our maturity groups. Remember that maturity in soybeans is different than maturity in corn, which is very much driven by heat units. In the case of soybean, maturity is driven by day length. And as our days get shorter, nights get longer, that is what is stimulating these soybeans to turn reproductive, begin flowering, and going into pod set and pod fill. With that, within that range of optimum planting dates, we should be solid for these whatever maturity group you're running. I gave the one example. If we do think we're on the far edge, we're utilizing that every day of that growing window, and we start to fall out of the ideal planting window for soybeans, maybe then we want to start tightening that up a little, something shorter.
And Tina, there's been some conversation or continued conversation about maybe planting soybeans before corn, and any thoughts on that?
I think it kind of depends on what we are trying, what the weather outlook's going to be, right? Are we trying to get the soybeans in the ground early enough that the soybeans may just kind of sit there for a little bit if the soil conditions are not right? We do want soil conditions to be above, as close to 60 degrees as possible. Not trying to have too many cool, chilling nights on those soybeans because we can run into other issues that way. But we might not want to wait forever for the corn to get planted either, because there's the give and the take of making sure, and especially in dryland situations, we're planting early enough to gain enough growing degree units that our crops, whether it is soybean or corn, those reproductive phases are lining up when we're most likely going to get rain.
Logan, Tina, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks, Shelby.
Those were K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan and Logan Simon. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by checking out 2 recent Agronomy E update articles. I will link them in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. The latest K-State Garden Hour looked at methods for increasing vegetable yield in the home garden. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Sedgwick County, Abbey Draut, discussed how to select high-performance varieties, the difference between heirloom and hybrids, and where to find a list of high-yielding vegetables. She says there are several things to consider when looking for high-performance varieties.
Looking at disease resistance, insect tolerance, weather adaptability, and the overall yield potential. If you want a bountiful harvest, it's essential to select plants suited also to your growing conditions for where you're at. Plus, you also want to take into consideration like flavor, color, and texture, because those things matter. You're going to eat them, right? Or you're going to use them in dishes. And then also consider the size and space of your garden and what you actually have room for, because you don't want to crowd your plants super close together. They're not going to be terribly productive in that way if they're fighting for space in the soil and above, or you don't have good air movement between, and then you're kind of inviting insect and pest disease problems there. Now, heirlooms, let's talk a little bit about the difference between heirlooms and hybrids. So heirlooms are varieties that have been passed down for generations and valued for good flavor and unique characteristics. They tend to offer things like, exceptional flavor, unique colors and shapes. I love heirloom tomatoes because I love the different shapes of them, especially all the ribbed varieties. They have tender skin and flesh, but they also have some problems. They're a little less disease resistant. They tend to be a little lower yielding, and they tend to be a little later fruiting, which means a longer wait for your harvest. Now, looking at hybrids, they're intentionally crossbred to enhance certain traits, which makes them a pretty popular choice if you're looking for high-yielding varieties. And that's because they provide consistent and uniform size, shape, and color. They generally have good disease resistance and tolerance. They have more compact plant habits and traits, and reliable quality and performance. And so some people like to plant a little bit of both. So if you're looking at hybrid varieties and one is a little more earlier producer, let's say for tomatoes, and then one is a later producer, you can plant the hybrids first, get those going, and then you get a good harvest there. And then as those maybe start to slow down from the heat, and your heirlooms are still producing, and then you have that later crop coming on. So you don't have to choose one or the other. You can definitely use both to increase your yields in your vegetable garden. I wanted to touch on where to find a list, because I'm sure people are wondering, where can I find a list of high-yielding varieties? And that's kind of a tricky question because it's really variable. It's variable because it's based off of your zone, available research, your location, what's been researched, what's been through trials, what's not been through trials. So kind of the best starting place to find a list or to figure out what works best in your area is to check with local greenhouses and nurseries and what they're growing and recommending, or your extension office can recommend suitable varieties to your area. K-State, we do have a publication that has recommended vegetable varieties. And then if you do get a list, do some of your own research. So look online at the vegetable distributors from seed distributors and see what those varieties say. See if they say they're high yielding varieties, if it's something you're wanting to grow. And then talk to your other local sources like your fellow gardeners. If you've got a neighbor next door and he's constantly trying to give away cucumbers, ask him what kind of cucumber he's growing if you're trying to grow a lot, or you're trying to do some sort of pickling and you need a ton of cucumbers. Unfortunately, we don't have a well-compiled list to just hand you and say, here you go, do that, and put these out, and then you're going to have a bountiful harvest. It does take a little bit of extra work on your part to do some research and figure that out, but that'll make you more successful in the end to have tailored varieties that do well in your area. The healthier your plants, the higher your yields are going to be. And hopefully all these tips will get you there and can help you have a successful crop this growing season.
That's Abbey Draut, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Sedgwick County. She also discussed the importance of soil health, fertilizing, watering, and mulching to improve vegetable yield. The full presentation is available online by searching for K-State Garden Hour. The Kansas Garden Guide, also available online and through the KSRE bookstore, is a recommended resource for all gardeners. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.